Hi, this is Paul coming from an undisclosed location in Nebraska. I guess I'm in the same state as Grim Grizz if he's home right now. Well, that's good because I'm going to have a little clip of Grim Grizz in this video. I'm not all in my office with my studio. I get this thing over my head, kind of looks like a big tall hat, kind of looks like a chef hat. My wife just shakes her head. She never sits and she never sees me making the videos, and so this is a treat for her. She laughs. All right, so down to business. One of the it does. If I it's kind of like a chef hat right here with the thing on my head. Anyway, yeah. If you've never been to this channel before, my apologies. This probably isn't the place you want to be. But so part of when I'm on vacation, right before I went on vacation, Strawn sent me a tweet from Peterson where he did a poll on his Twitter about whether or not what people like better, his talks with interesting people or the Snow White psychological interpretation that he did. And Snow White psychological interpretation got like 80% of the poll, and the interesting people talks that he's been doing tons and tons and tons of ever since he went to Daily Wire got 20% of the talk. And so at the beginning of his Snow White video that he did a few weeks ago, he basically said that, and so I think we should be expecting more of those kinds of videos. Now, I've commented before that the numbers on his interesting people talks have just continued to go down and down and down and down. I don't watch many of them unless I've got a reason to, or a bunch of people say, oh, you should watch this one. I did make a video about the Scott Adams one, partly because of my interest in Scott Adams. And then, as I noted in that video, some of the best content in that video was in the Daily Wire exclusive app. I made that video not too long ago. So then after Strawn sent me that, was like my last day in my office. And so then I thought, okay, I should watch the Peterson Snow White thing, which I was a little surprised about because, of course, Jonathan Peugeot has done his own take on Snow White. And there were a couple of videos a couple of years ago on Snow White. And I thought, well, that'll be interesting. So I decided that, during... I'd try and listen to the Jordan Peterson Snow White video. And yeah, I think it was actually kind of a disaster. It wasn't good. Well, why wasn't it good? Okay, well, let's roll back. So I had some clips because, again, I can't do things interstitially as easy when I'm just doing this in a hotel room and I don't have hours to do this. I've just got some thoughts in my head and I want to get them out, and so that's why I'm doing this. And with the hotel Wi-Fi, I ought to be able to send some things up. So Peterson has talked about fairy tales for a long time. And if you go back into his classroom lectures, he, of course, deals with Pinocchio quite extensively, and I think quite effectively. There's a video that a number of people over the last month had mentioned to me when they were talking about Peterson. They talked about when he was talking to Dave Rubin and he talked about Pinocchio. And I think I had missed that video. That video was out about 8 years ago. So I decided to go back and look it up. And one of the things so I'm going to play a clip from that. It's towards the end of that. And that clip really sort of hits on exactly what Peterson was doing about 8 years ago. Now, rewatching it now, again, all of the themes were there, but one of the big differences between what he's doing now, what he did now with that psychological interpretation of Snow White, and what he did 8 years ago with respect to Pinocchio was he wasn't complaining about culture war type stuff in there. He did plenty of that too, but the main purpose of his address was towards young men, and obviously with Pinocchio, with the growing nose and everything, a big part of that was don't lie. And he explained in very good terms what lying does to people and why you shouldn't do it. And he was especially addressing young men. And so I thought I'd begin with that clip because that's a powerful clip. And having, of course, lived through all of that history of the rise of Jordan Peterson and the rise of his fame and the effectiveness of his message and the impact that he really had on younger men. Again, I've told this story a number of times. Part of what happened at the rise of my own channel is I started doing commentaries on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, and I began to notice in conversation after conversation after conversation, particularly with young men who had been watching a lot of his videos, that they had been depressed and watching him relieve the depression. And I came to the conclusion that a lot of their source of the depression was nihilism. And in following what Jordan was telling them to do, their nihilism was lifting. And I knew at that point that they would need to that would probably be temporary, and they would probably need to get onto a religious track or have a community around them or have quite a bit more than just watching videos to engage with other people in real life for them to continue to make progress in that direction. And so, again, I'll just drop this clip in here where it's a really powerful moment. And again, Peterson is clearly passionate. His focus is sort of single-mindedly to help young men sort out their lives, get their lives in shape, make progress, and in the process of doing that, discover their agency. And once they discover their agency, once they start to build their life, then things will improve. And again, for thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of young men, that's what happened. And for that reason, he was so impressive and successful, and he did so much good. So I'll drop that clip in here.
It says in the New Testament that man does not live by bread alone. And that's a technical commentary on the utility of the truth. The truth is, you could say, spiritual food. And I use that metaphor purposefully. You live on information. You're a cognitive apparatus. You live on information, and in information you transform information into the tools you use to operate within the world. And if your tools are faulty, then your life will be terrible. If you're fed on a diet of deceit, then you'll be pathological in everything you do, and the world will kick back at you extraordinarily hard. The first thing it'll do is deprive you of any sense of meaning, and then it'll make you bitter, and then it'll make you resentful, and then it'll make you murderous, and then it'll make you genocidal. That's the developmental pathway. And those kids, the people who shoot up the high schools, they've already hit murderous. They're nigh on the way to genocidal. And part of the reason is that a life that's characterized by nothing but deceit has no positive meaning in it, but plenty of suffering, because you can lie to yourself and you can lie to other people, but the probability that you're going to be able to talk yourself out of your terror and pain is zero. And as far as I can tell, truth is the only genuine antidote to suffering, because getting rid of suffering, that isn't going to happen. The only thing you can do is live in a manner that enables you to withstand suffering without becoming corrupt. And that means that you live by the truth, and no matter what. And then there's a coda that goes along with that, which is something that took me decades to understand, is that Kierkegaard talked about this a fair bit when he talked about the leap of faith necessary for true religious belief. Said, telling the truth is it's a gamble on the benevolence of being. So the idea is, well, you tell the truth. You don't manipulate the world to make it give you what you want. You just say what you try to articulate yourself and articulate the manner of your being as clearly and comprehensively as possible. And then you see what happens. And you decide, this is the act of faith, you decide that no matter what happens, if you tell the truth, that that's the best possible outcome. And the thing is that at the bottom of your being, there's always a decision that has to be made about how you're going to interact in the world. Mm-hmm. Because you have free choice, whatever that means. You seem to have it. And so you have to make a decision about how it is that you're going to act in the world. And you act in truth if you can. That's the pathway out of the kind of misery that makes people bitter and far worse than bitter.
Yeah, well, it's incredibly obvious to me that you're living in your truth, and because you're doing that, you're waking up a lot of other people, which is why so many people wanted me to talk to you. So, what do you think? This will be the final question. Yeah. What do you think is the best way to, if for all the people that are watching this right now, that understand this, that hear you, that understand the passion, that want to live that way too? How can they get involved in this process? Is it simply just doing?
No, I can tell you. Yeah, I can tell you. All right, so. Most of your viewers will have watched Pinocchio.
Probably.
There's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto wishes on a star, right? And what it means is he lifts up his eyes beyond the horizon to something transcendent, to something ultimate, because that's what a star is. It's part of the eternity of the night sky. And so he lifts his eyes up above his daily concerns and he says, what I want What I want more than anything else is that my creation will become a genuine individual, right? It's a heroic gesture because it's so unlikely. And that catalyzes the puppet's transformation into a real being. And we start as puppets. And so the trick is to get rid of your goddamn strings. And you remember in Pinocchio, he faces a lot of temptations. One is to be a liar. The other is to be a neurotic victim. That's how he ends up in Pleasure Island, where he just about gets sold into the salt mines, turns into a brain jackass and sold to the salt mines because it's run by authoritarians. Well, okay, so what you do is you lift up your eyes and you say, look, I would like being to progress in the best possible manner. And that's best for me, best for my family, best for society, maybe best for the world. Simultaneously, I would like to attain that. Whatever that is, that's what I want. You commit to that. Then you tell the truth. And then you can tell if you're telling the truth. You can tell it physiologically. And so this is something to learn. You watch what you say, and you will find out that some things you say make you come apart. They make you fall apart. And you can feel it. It's physiologically. It's centered in your solar plexus. It's a feeling of chaotic weakness and dissolution. It's a sense of self-betrayal. And then if you tell the truth, that pulls you together and strengthens you. And so you can learn to feel when your words are accurately articulating yourself. And then you practice that. And that makes you into the sort of person that won't be an Auschwitz guard, that won't play ideological games, that won't sacrifice other people to their expediency. And that's what you have to do. And that's really the core idea in Western civilization, is to build yourself into a forthright individual who's capable of telling the truth and capable of bearing the responsibilities of citizenry. And that's what people have to do.
Now, this next clip I want to play is a part of Jordan's conversation with Jonathan Pageau at about the time when Jonathan was finishing up his version of Snow White. So when I listened to Jordan's Snow White, the one that he just released now, I found it enormously frustrating because it was bad preaching. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as a preacher and a Christian minister, I'm always trying to draw relationships between an ancient text and the contemporary world and try to do that in a helpful and productive way. And there's something that's didactic about that. You have to teach something about the text, teach something about the world of the text, and then help people connect it to their world now and help them take steps of action towards getting closer to God, improving their lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very interested in how Jordan deals with the text. Now, for the last few years, we've been watching him deal with the Bible. And while his first biblical series I thought was was really amazing. It was groundbreaking. It caught the attention of a lot of people. I think both his Exodus series and his Gospel series, those seminars, I thought they were good. I enjoyed listening to them. But as I mentioned to Martin Shaw when I had my conversation with him a little while ago, what Jordan's been doing with the Bible, he's always had a sort of a correspondentism going. And his concordism was sort of between that which is in the text and then these sort of archetypes or perennial patterns that go on in the world. And that's fine. Jonathan Peugeot does a similar thing. When you listen to Peterson talk to Peugeot, I thought that conversation worked well. First of all, they're friends. They know each other well enough. They have a good give and take. And so in this clip that I'm going to drop, they discuss Snow White and they discuss the dwarves. And the dwarves were particularly, I think, a particularly bad part of Jordan's recent video on Snow White.
To rather recapture the culture, right? Take it back instead of complaining that it's slipping away from us. Yeah.
I wrote a fairy tale screenplay.
Yes.
The Water of Life.
Yeah.
Right, and I've written and composed, I think there must be 20 songs in it, I would think, but we've already recorded 4 of them. And looking into having it made into an animated movie, I mean, that technology is changing so quickly, it's hard to exactly know how to approach that.
Yeah, what's the easiest way to approach it?
Yeah, but I took the Grimm's brother fairy tale, Water of Life, and I stayed fairly close to it, although I wrote music for it, lyrics for it, and so forth. And so that was a very entertaining project. It's a very deep fairy tale and very nicely structured. No one's done anything with that particular fairy tale before.
And it's a good time to do that, I think, because when you look at Disney's Snow White, it was perfect. I mean, it was so beautiful and so powerful. And then when you see what's been happening in the past decade and how the fairy tales have been kind of twisted, especially things like Shrek and fairy tales like that, where it's fine to do that. It's kind of like commenting or twisting the fairy tale, turning it upside down to see what's going on with it, making fun of it. And that's fine for a while, but after a while, it's better to get back to the actual stories, just so we even remember why we like these stories in the first place, or why we remember them especially. Snow White, all these stories of, these female-led fairy tales, they're very powerful in what they can do. And so, if we forget them or if we try to twist them, then we're also twisting, in some ways, the fabric of Western civilization. Because these old stories, right, they kind of lie at the bottom of, all these folk stories, they're kind of like I like to think of them as kind of like tuning forks for civilization. All these stories that people have been telling for centuries that, there's an emergent part of it, right? There's all these variations of all these stories. And then there's a selection part, which is how some versions are remembered through the centuries and they get retold and then they kind of change and get retold. So they get refined like, almost like gold. And so in those they're the things you can't forget. That's right.
Yeah, and that can't would mean 2 things. It means you literally can't forget them because they embed themselves in your memory, but also that you forget them at your peril.
Yeah.
But I was been thinking about that, with this postmodernist notion. So one of the claims of postmodernism is that there's no meta-narrative. And you and I have talked a fair bit about the fractal structure of narrative. And I talked to Carl Friston about object perception itself. And I asked him if he thought that the perception of an object was a narrative in and of itself. And he said yes.
Yeah.
And that's associated with the notion that when you see an object, you're actually perceiving something like its functional utility and not its objective qualities, let's say.
Yeah.
And so it's narratives all the way down, right, to the very basis of what you would perceive as a singular object. So even the concept of perceptual unity is narrative in structure. And if that's true, then the postmodernist idea that there's no grand unifying narrative is an argument of convenience, because what the postmodernists essentially do is allow the narrative to be fragmented to the point that's maximally convenient for whatever the hell they're up to, and say, well, there's nothing above this.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's very convenient, guys. But
Yeah.
everything. So without a unifying narrative, you have fragmentation and disunity, and that's associated. It's associated neuropsychologically with anxiety and hopelessness. And so,
But what's great about the fairy tales is that they actually deal with that exactly. So in one way, what you could say is that the basic story structure, Campbell had this whole hero's journey, which is powerful, and I think he captures something real. But you can reduce the story to basic one, like a one move, right? Like down and up. Basically, problem and then dealing with the problem, right? Situation, problem, or question, and then dealing with the question. And that can help us understand why it's related to object perception, because that's what it is, right? You don't do it consciously, but you're constantly kind of asking what's important, what's relevant. And you can imagine when you see something that you don't know what it is, it's a crisis, especially if it's coming at you in a way. You have to answer that question, and it's a life or death. It can be a life or death situation. You end up in a place where you don't know what's happening, you don't know what's coming towards you, and you have to answer that. And I think the story the basic story pattern captured that, and the fairy tales, most of them, they capture that very much. Because, for example, Snow White, which we're telling now, it has that story. So Snow White, things happen to her. She ends up, something changes, and then she ends up in the forest, with these little monsters,
with dwarf men.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the eternal predicament of women, is to be surrounded by dwarfed men.
Yeah. But you can understand it. It has multiple levels, but you can understand as the very transformation of a young woman. It does have to do with puberty. Snow White pretty much has to do with puberty. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on there, is that as she reaches puberty, she deals with all the problems of puberty, you could say, or that transformation. It's a question. What the hell is happening to me? Like, what is going on? And I don't have the answer. And especially for a young woman, this cycle of menstruation, it's annoying and it's painful, and what is this? Like,
dangerous.
What is happening to me? And so the story of Snow White has this moment where as she becomes possible, she comes into competition with the queen, right? She comes to the moment where she can now be in competition with the queen.
Right.
Then she goes into the woods, into the space of chaos, but then she also, she falls in with men that can't be her mate. Idiosyncrasies of masculinity.
Say that again.
Idiosyncrasies of masculinity. All the things about masculinity that are kind of annoying, like in Disney captures it really well,
with the various
the kind of
dwarfs.
grouchy, and like there's all these different kind of aspects of masculinity.
Yeah, they're not united.
Exactly.
Yeah, so those are, you can think about each of those dwarfs as the embodiment of a fragmentary narrative.
Exactly,
right?
a fragmentary,
a micro narrative that isn't the print. If you could mix all the dwarfs together and extract out the best, you'd have a prince.
Exactly. That's right. That's the right way to see it. And then Snow White gets caught in that world, and then she has to learn, especially for a traditional worldview, she has to learn the job of a woman, right? She has to learn to clean and to cook and to do that. And it's like, what is this for? Like, she gets all the
that's
problems.
in the service to those dwarves, too, weirdly enough.
Well,
that's also the plaint of modern women, too, is that I'm doing all this cooking and cleaning for nothing but dwarves.
That's right, exactly. And so then, obviously that all leads to her dying, you could say, or falling asleep. There are many iterations of her falling asleep in the story. They're all related, right? She falls asleep and then she's woken up by dwarves, which is like,
right.
That's not going to do it.
Why wake up at all?
That's not going to do it. And then, work and learn to clean and do all that stuff and kind of live in the forest. And then ultimately that leads to her second falling asleep and then being woken up by the right mate. And so the solution, then she finds the reason for all of this. So what's the reason for this cycle of transformation? What's the reason for all these changes in her body, in her life, as she's kind of in that transition, and then finding her mate, basically finding her husband, finding her prince, that answers the question.
So do you...
Now, part of what I found, if you look at what Jordan did with Pinocchio and what Jordan was doing in those first years, you hear just briefly in that conversation with Peugeot, where Peugeot says, I want to rewrite these fairy tales. I don't want to just analyze and complain. Now, it might strike you as ironic because, well, isn't this video some analysis and complaint? Yes, it is. So, okay. I don't want to just analyze and complain. I want to do this hard work of, again, attending to the foundations of the culture by making a contribution. And again, if you look at what Jordan was doing with fairy tales 7-8 years ago, how he was applying them, he was speaking directly to his audience and saying, this is the action you should take. When you look at what he's doing with this video, it's mostly, it smells like a lot of audience capture. Now, it's interesting because I don't know to what degree Daily Wire is responsible for this. Because again, part of the way that you make money on YouTube is you find a topic that there's a whole group of people that they're annoyed about or afraid about or angry about, and you reflect their annoyance, fear, or their anger back to them. And Daily Wire does a ton of this. All we want to do is talk against these people and against these people and against these people and against these people. And that's pretty much what Jordan does with his Snow White video. Now, it isn't that there aren't interesting things to discuss about that. And so maybe I'll drop the Grim Grizz video in here, where, of course, this is an issue that Grizz is very excited about. And so
the reproductive advantage. In species such as marmosets, dominant females actually emit pheromones that directly inhibit ovarian activity in subordinate females, preventing them from cycling or conceiving. By monopolizing food, mates, or safe nesting sites, dominant females limit subordinates' ability to sustain pregnancies or raise offspring, as seen in some tamarin groups. The suppression is often temporary and context dependent, lifting if the subordinate status improves or she leaves the group.
So you're saying dominant females in the shadow matriarchy try to suppress the reproduction of the subordinate females, perhaps by getting them to have forearm surgeries. And then at 7 minutes, 12 seconds.
That there's no higher priority for young women than to organize their lives around a career. Well, if you want an explanation, fertility suppression by elites with regard to subordinate women foolish enough to listen to such advice certainly constitutes a explanatory hypothesis. And it's a...
Oh, boy, does it constitute an explanatory hypothesis. People might have thought I was projecting that argument onto you, but then you just said it out loud like that.
About it's including children. Okay, so a few comments about the Brothers Grimm. It's been a contention of mine for some decades and a cornerstone of my work that our consciousness is structured in the same manner as a story. In fact, I think you can make a very strong case, I believe an incontrovertible case, that what a story is a verbal description of the framing of conscious experience. Now, what that implies at a very...
And if that's a big stretch for you, you can at least see it as a story, as a conveyance and compression of context to by which the entity can align itself. If the context that frames the situation is conveyed via story. A story, like the story of how you felt virtually not alone watching a Grim Grizz live stream on a Saturday in July.
Deep level is that for diverse individuals to organize themselves into a culture, they have to develop a mechanism such that their consciousness is framed in a similar manner, so that they pursue similar goals, they have similar values, and they experience similar emotions. The only way to do that, as far as I can tell, is to provide a foundation of shared narrative. And so the Grimm brothers were particularly.
And what better way to provide the foundation of shared narrative than by having three main channels broadcast that same narrative through the altar in everybody's living room they call set.
The evil queen produced the pathological fruit of knowledge that dooms Snow White to death, administering it under the guise of compassion and caring in the form of a fruit so attractive that anyone with eyes would be tempted to take it. Brutal. Now I can rest in peace, she said. Once again, I'm the most beautiful in the land, and Snow White will remain dead this time. So, couldn't kill her with the bodice, or the corset, couldn't kill her with the poisonous comb, but could certainly kill her with the consumption of the fatal apple. When the dwarfs came home from the mines that evening, they found little Snow White lying on the ground, and she was dead. They unlaced her and tried to find something poisonous in her hair, but nothing helped. They couldn't revive her. Okay, so what does that mean? The core element of the evil queen is so unbelievably pathological, so destructive, that ordinary, conscientious, diligent, protective masculinity is revealed as insufficient to redress the poison. Right. So that's why the queen, the prince has to come along. Right. It's only the higher order form of masculinity that's associated with true nobility and true courage that has the archetypal force, you might say, to provide true protection from the depredations of the evil queen. Well, Snow White is the helpmeet of the dwarfs, right? But there's no individualized relationship there. She hasn't moved beyond cooperation with the social patriarchy as such to the establishment of a personalized relationship with an individual and identifiable man, right? So she's still in the land of generic masculinity. And that's a hell of a lot better than the land of pathological evil queen destructive femininity, but it's not a relationship that's of sufficient depth and intensity to provide protection against the most fatal of feminine poisons. They couldn't revive her, so they laid her on a bier, and all 7 of them sat down beside it and wept for 3 whole days. Then they intended to bury her, but she still looked more alive than dead, and she still had such pretty red cheeks. So instead they made a glass coffin and placed her inside so that she could easily be seen. So they're worshiping her in a sense, even in her poisoned and near-dead state. They still value her, right? So what does that mean? It means that the ordinary men apprehending an attractive young woman who has been poisoned by the teachings of the evil queen still hope in their soul for the revivification of her spirit, but are unable to match the machinations of the evil queen themselves.
But part of what dominates Jordan's recent Snow White video is just this question of female hierarchies and fertility. And okay, fair enough. I think that's obviously there's a fertility crisis going on. And obviously, I think I share Jordan's concern that women are burning through their 20s and even their early 30s and not working to develop a future. They're prioritizing their career. Now, there's some reasons for that. If you look at what happened with divorce in the 70s, many of the mothers of these women, especially those who found themselves divorced without a career option built before, taught their daughters, don't count on a man. You'd better have a career option, because if you put all your eggs in the basket of getting a husband and having a family, and that man betrays you or leaves you, you're going to be stuck without very many career options. And so the culture has moved in the way that it has. But Peterson's mostly complaining about it. So one of the things that I did was I spent some time listening to some other fairy tales. And obviously with fairy tales, there's almost always an element of the magical. And you can connect that with, say, Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. And part of what I think make the fairy tales work is that they are deep and nuanced. For example, I listened to the fairy tale of the Golden Bird, Grimm's version of it. Not Grimm Grizz's version, but the Brothers Grimm. And it's an excellent fairy tale. It's a wonderful story. And there are subtle little morality lessons in many of these fairy tales, but these fairy tales can't be reduced to morality lessons. In that one in particular, the hero of the story continues to fail. In the end, finally succeeds, and there's a victory that's won. And in that story, it ends happily. But there's a whole lot more depth, and there's an understanding that Tolkien really picks up on fairy stories, that when you get into the land of fairy, that it's unpredictable. And I think that's part of the reason that these stories are so formative and healthy and continue to live on, because they're not simply reducible. There's enough pattern in them to derive lessons and to build wisdom, but there's also enough chaos in them that the learner must stay on their toes and continue to be aware and not sort of get bored or lulled by simplistic formulas. I think it's a far more interesting question as to what hierarchies women are competing with each other for. Now, it's certainly the case that women do compete with each other for male attention and for high status men. But one of the things that has been severely disrupted in our society is that I don't understand older high status women as suppressing the fertility of young women in order that these older women can what? Make more money? I think if Peterson had wanted to go into this question, which I think is a very fair question, I think it would have been a fruitful question, because what exactly is the telos? What exactly is the end? What exactly is the goal? What exactly is the hierarchy that many of these women that Peterson is complaining about are working towards? And I would have to say, in many cases, they're simply competing with men. Now, in some aspects, they might be competing with other women for men, and there are definite, we were driving through Leadville, Colorado, and often when my wife and I take these trips, we'll pass through a town, and one of us will ask the other one to do a little bit of research on this thing that we just saw. And we were hearing about Leadville, and there was one of these mining magnates, who developed a huge amount of money mining silver. And as often happens, you can look at someone like Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos makes his billions, and then he cheats on his wife, and she cashes in for like $46 billion. Now, what happened with this silver mining wealthy man is that he ditched his first wife and then married a much younger woman, And I mean, that's a fairly standard story, and you see that often. And you do watch women compete with each other, and older women and younger women. But to just simply say it's fertility suppression, I really don't think. Now, you might make an argument that this is all sort of subconscious and going on. Well, okay, well, make that argument. Don't just complain about it and dump on it. And again, one of the things, as I noted back in the Jordan Peterson Jubilee, just the anger comes through. And again, when you look at what he did with Dave Rubin, early Peterson, 2016, 2017, 2018, much more compassion, much more understanding that people are victims of principalities and powers, and then addressing the audience directly with respect to change and for change. Now, I don't know that young women will ever be the primary focus of Jordan's work. I think in many ways, even while in 2016, 2017, young men were really the focus of his work, I'm not sure. The focus of his work now seems much more theoretical, civilizational, but it doesn't have that power and that punch that it had individually. Maybe I'll drop again this favorite clip that I have with Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho, when he's talking about young men and he's comparing James Bond and High Noon. And I think if you want to, and this is what I've seen with respect to a lot of the conversations going on with respect to, let's say, reactive feminism, where, you know, some younger women are sort of reacting to the hierarchy of a career and saying, no, what I'd really like to do is develop for myself a family and a future in that direction. And I think it's analogous to what Dr. Jim says about High Noon versus James Bond. And if you look at the culture, you might say that in some ways, just like men's attention and focus has been hijacked by certain narratives, women have been hijacked. Their focus has been hijacked by certain narratives. I think that's fair. But to say that this is a result of older women trying to suppress the fertility of younger women doesn't seem to track. So I'll play the Dr. Jim clip.
And then I'm looking at this recent, let's say, domination of a certain kind of storytelling. And I'm seeing that something in the tradition that I am very familiar with is missing. It's not really there. And now I'm going to try to describe that thing that I think is missing. I played in my mind a couple of ways of trying to introduce this, and I think perhaps the simplest way is the Western. I studied Westerns for a while, about 10 or 15 years ago, and High Noon is kind of a classically structured Western. It's a 50s Western by a guy named Howard Hawks, and it's a very simple story. There's a sheriff. He is getting married to the pure girl from the East who arrives in town. She's a school teacher. He's going to get married to her, and he's going to give up his sheriff job because he's cleaned up the town and everything's hunky-dory, and he's going to ride off into the sunset with his new bride. And right at the beginning of the movie, the guy he put in jail 7 years ago or so has been unjustly let out of jail and is coming to town. He's going to recreate the bad world that the sheriff had cleaned up. And in the midst of it, he's going to kill the sheriff. His goal is revenge against the sheriff. And the story plays out, in somewhat complicated ways that aren't important to the point I'm trying to make. But of course, the wedding is off. He's now the sheriff again, and no one wants to help him. But the story builds to the point where there's the showdown. Of course, it's at High Noon. And there's complications between him and the woman along the way, but in the end, right near the end of the movie, mano a mano in the street, sheriff kills the villain and rides up the school teacher, his bride. He throws down the sheriff's star, and they ride out of town, and that's the end of the movie. Now, that's the thing. The end of that is the thing that I think is missing and has kind of fallen off the map of storytelling recently. And I want to give that thing a little bit more flesh. It's what I want to call a generative arena. It's a circumstance in which the acting out of that world is building the future. It's possibility, and it's a kind of a stable place looking out into an open future. And of course, it's symbolized by a man and a woman and the potential for them to have children. And so that image would change the U-shaped journey of the hero, because it would put the end to be not really an end or the circle that Campbell has, but rather a destination. There would be a real destination there, maybe a plateau that is reached. And that's the goal. That's the telos of that story, of that narrative.
Right.
I'm going to start with James Bond.
Okay.
Because you look at a standard James Bond flick, and it's got almost the exact structure, right?
Yep.
There's James Bond. He's an MI6. He's there flirting with what's her name, and he's a smart guy. He's a great fighter. He's all that. And the crisis. We've got a villain, and he charges out to fight the villain. Bad things happen, obstacles. Alongside is this Bond girl. Oh, there she is, the Bond girl. She's there. She's with him. He's not gonna make it. He's trapped. He's the fates are against him. Whatever. Overcome the obstacles, destroy the villain, and there's he and the Bond girl in the love nest at the end of the film. And he's so involved in this, relationship that he doesn't even take the congratulations from MI6, as they call, or whatever. It's a classic ending, right? But James Bond is not a father, and the Bond girl is not a mother. That's not part of who they are. And I don't even, someone might say, well, maybe they'll go off again. But no, it's the structure of the narrative, the structure of the character is that they are not that person, in fact. And so there is no generativity there. And what there is eternal recurrence. The only thing that can happen, and obviously did happen on a repeated basis, is that Bond shakes himself off after his tryst, and he goes back to MI6, and he flirts with the girl behind the desk, and a new villain pops up, and off we go again. And this is a kind of a flat world. The world has nothing really in it except a Bond character at a given age. This is an ageless character, or he has no youth and he has no old age, although the guy who's playing him gets older as it goes on, but the character himself is frozen. This is a static, right, and essentially sterile world. You can have the ecstatic individual effort, heroic, experiential, kind of seeking out thrills and seeking out experience. That's not necessarily wrong intrinsically, as long as it's got the right telos.
Right.
And in the end, that telos is the generative
future.
Right.
And it's not, and see, this was part of, when I was talking about the hero's journey, what I've seen is that in many ways that, Peterson and many others are framing the hero's journey as a story of self-actualization.
Exactly.
And it's, yep. And certainly there is self-actualization that happens, but that I think is part of the blindness of individualism. And, and what you actually have in a fuller, better, bigger story that I think we find finally more satisfying is that there's self-realization, self-actualization going on in Sam, in Frodo, but now Frodo and Bilbo's self-actualization is finally in some ways, sacrificial. Now they go off into the gray havens, with the elves,
Right.
but it's, there's a longing and a mourning. And even though in some ways in that universe, the elves are going back to they're returning home. In some ways, the elves in Middle Earth were colonials.
Yeah, it seems to me like Tolkien's kind of not quite wanting to frame exactly what that is supposed to be. I mean, but it clearly is this it's not like it would be right to end the movie with Frodo living in the house next door to Sam with his
wife and children.
Wife and child. That would not be the end. That's not the correct end.
Right. So I think that's most of what I wanted to say. I do, in general, think that possibly Jordan returning to some of his work with fairy tales could be an improvement over what he's been doing, but I don't know that. I know that talking through it with Jonathan Peugeot was good. Jordan always seemed to need, and when you look at what formed him, you look at classroom lectures. I know I haven't watched any of the Peterson Academy stuff, so I haven't seen any of that. You look at, let's say, his biblical series, like the seminar, the biblical seminars. I think that setting is really good for him. I don't know that sort of the using the fairy tales instead of the Bible preacher setting really works well for him. The thing about the Bible is that despite all of the bad preaching that the Bible is subject to, you can't really wear it out. The fairy tales, I don't know. So those are my thoughts on that. If it's helpful, let me know. Leave a comment.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Peugeot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. The ghost with a messiah complex. A messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us, baptized in ball pits, The clowns served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers. See what I say. Just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried in a fading dream.
Just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. No patriarch or any genitals are gonna stop the logos flowing theological. Amen, amen, amen. Amen, 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 amen. Oh, it's relation ontological, philosophy as well as lovely symbolology. 'Cause it's just you and me. We're fellowshipping and communing on the open sea. Amen, 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 amen. Sola Scriptura hagiography, the sacred dances and rejoices with the scrutiny. I'm just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. Amen, 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 amen. Amen, amen, amen. I'm just a Midwest metagelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals. We're pointed up to New Jerusalem, but can't agree on where and how or if and when it be. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day trespasses, as we forgive those who trespassed against us, and lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen, 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 amen. I'm just a Midwest evangelical, talking about God and life and other hypotheticals.